is simply
So
appearing.
things that used to make you angry or frustrated, do they still make you angry or frustrated?
They can do. Although over the years, some of the consequences, you could say, of those many years of assuming that there was a someone, which causes, in fact, a certain amount of stress and strain. Unfortunately, despite what I believed and hoped, liberation isn't salvation. It doesn't mean that all the difficulties and issues and strains of life immediately dissolve. Some, there's no way of predicting how much, some will fall away over time. And so some things have certainly got easier, much easier. So in a general sense, I'd say that there's much more happiness, much more well-being than there was. It's not that there was a lot of misery before, but life is much more enjoyable.
So kind of there's still a personality there in
Absolutely.
one way, and that personality is maybe clearing itself over time, do you think? Would you put it that way?
Well, I don't know that it's clearing itself, but there's just greater ease. So there seems to be less strain, more well-being. But it's not about becoming perfect. It's not, or saintly, or being without any anger or fear. It's not like that at all. In a sense, it's much more ordinary. And one of the things that was realized that morning on Hampstead Heath was that the previous experiences, which you could call experiences of awakening that came and went, they were extraordinary, and they were very different from ordinary life. But they faded. What happened that morning was something very, very ordinary. And yet what was realized was that the ordinary is amazing, is wondrous. That everything, the most mundane object or whatever, is actually radiant being and an unconditional love. Not that it became that after that moment of dissolution, but rather that it always has been, and assumed not to be anything other than something mundane. So the mundane turned out to be much more wondrous and extraordinary than the experiences that had previously been had. And that continues. While ordinary life carries on.
It goes on, yeah. And do you feel that the work you did, we'll maybe go into that more detail a little bit later, but the work you did over those 40 years contributed to what happened?
No.
So it was just an independent thing, like...
It was. Now, that's not to say that, for example, the practice of meditation hadn't had many benefits. It had very many benefits. And what had happened attending meetings where this was discussed or described was that ideas and concepts about the nature of reality, some of those had fallen away. But there was still very firm assumption, even though there were ideas and beliefs that had changed, there was a firm assumption that there was a separate self, somehow in here somewhere, looking out at a separate world and having a private and personal experience of thoughts and physical sensations and memories and whatever, and behaviors. And that hadn't changed throughout the 40 years. And what it assumed to be the personal self at the beginning of all that seeking hadn't changed in any way at all, despite all the practices and the books and the meetings. And so that morning, all the assumptions just went. And it was realized how clear, how obvious it had actually always been, and how mistaken I'd been the whole time.
So what you expected to happen didn't actually happen the way...
Nothing like, nothing like at all.
Yeah.
It was, as I said, more
quite
ordinary.
Fascinating,
yeah,
isn't it?
And I don't think it can be really anticipated, because the ideas and beliefs about what's going to happen are based inevitably on the understanding that there is a someone, trying to imagine that they're not a someone. And it just doesn't work.
But when you were a someone, did you enjoy being a someone? How did you look at it?
Yeah, there was enjoyment, yeah. And I enjoyed seeking and the practice of meditation and going to meetings. I found it fascinating and engaging, frustrating sometimes. But it was a very absorbing lifestyle. That wasn't the whole of my life, but it was a major part of my life. And but it wasn't nearly as fascinating as how life has been since that moment on Hampstead Heath.
So you weren't actually thinking, oh, I wish I could be different from the way I was, or if you thought that, it was a fairly gradual sort of difference.
That's right. I thought I just wanted more. Well, I think I had all sorts of fantasies about. I don't know quite what I imagined, that life would be somehow wondrously kind of harmonious, and there'd be no anger, no fear. Everything would be perfect. Somehow I'd float around, and I don't know what, the mortgage would get paid mysteriously by some kind of cosmic direct debit would be taken out, and everything would be taken care of. And it wasn't like that at all. So the ordinary activities carried on, but without any reference anymore to what was assumed to be a separate self. So there was there's no longer any reference. There's just being in which this is all appearing.
So your journey started quite young. I think you said you were reading J. Krishnamurti at 13 years old.
Afraid so, yes.
And well, that's in one way quite impressive that a fairly young child is rather than, I don't know, starting fights in the playground is.
Well, I did a certain amount of that as well.
But obviously something was drawing you at an early age.
Well, I think I had an idea that life could be different. It wasn't particularly happy home, and always had been a sense that it could be different. And my mother had a couple of books of talks, transcripts of Krishnamurti's, and I'd quite often go off and walk up to Hampstead Heath and take one or two books, either my own books or books from a bookshelf. And it just so happened that one morning or one afternoon I took one of those books, and I found it fascinating. I couldn't really understand what he was on about. The only thing I can remember, and it's a very distinct memory, is staring at another tree, because I was sitting up a tree, trying to see it the way he seemed to describe it was possible to see things, and that there was a correct way to see things, a true way of seeing things, and somehow I wasn't doing that. And I can remember getting a headache, and but something resonated. There was a sense, yeah, there must be something. And so that was really the start of thinking about it, of looking for it. And it took, I learned, not long after that I started traveling, and then I learned to meditate. I learned a Zen meditation, did that for a while. And I suppose was seeking in the sort of hippie way for several years, which didn't satisfy. And then I learned transcendental meditation, and that was transformative. I really felt radically different. And a couple of years later, I learned in 1972, and in 1974 I trained to be a teacher of the technique.
Right, yeah.